in a packed Memphis courtroom in the summer of 1972. Laughter rippled when the presiding judge mocked Elvis Presley for daring to appear in person. Yet within minutes, the same room of jurors, lawyers, and townsfolk fell into a silence so complete it felt sacred. What happened next would echo far beyond those walls. August 4th, 1972, Shelby County Courthouse, Memphis, Tennessee. The morning sun slanted through tall windows, striking the polished oak benches with ribbons of gold. Outside, a restless crowd had gathered since dawn, fans, reporters, and townsfolk, all hoping to catch a glimpse of Elvis Presley in a place no one expected, the witness stand. Inside, nearly 250 filled the chamber, the heavy air buzzing with whispers. The bailiff's voice cut through the noise. All rise, chairs scraped, and the doors swung open. Elvis entered not in his rhinestone jumpsuit, but in a tailored navy suit with a muted tie. His hair, carefully combed, still caught the light with that unmistakable sheen. The contrast was startling. Here was the king of rock and roll, stripped of spotlight and guitar, walking past rows of attorneys and clerks. Reporters scribbled furiously. A local journalist, Frank Dillard, later recalled, the air was thick with disbelief. We weren't sure if this was serious testimony or some kind of show. Every eye followed Elvis as he moved toward the witness stand. His footsteps muffled against the courthouse floor. When he sat down, he adjusted the microphone with practiced ease, the way he might on stage, and that small, unconscious gesture drew a murmur from the benches. Some giggled, some gasped. It was as if two worlds had collided, the gravity of the court and the glamour of Graceland. The judge, Harold Whitman, presided from his bench. Known for his brisk efficiency, he peered down at the singer with raised eyebrows. Court clerks exchanged glances, as though trying to decide whether this was truly happening. And yet, there he was, Elvis Presley, not in Las Vegas before 20,000 people, but in a Memphis courtroom before 250. For Elvis, this wasn't a performance. He had agreed to testify in a civil matter involving a close friend's disputed property. To him, loyalty demanded presence. To the crowd, however, the scene was charged with spectacle. Some fans leaned so far forward that deputies had to shush them. The smell of old wood, ink, and faint perfume lingered. The room felt caught between reverence and ridicule, a fragile balance waiting to tip. Elvis's gaze swept the chamber once, pausing briefly on the jurors. His face carried no smile, only quiet determination. A reflective question for us. What does it feel like when a figure known only for music and myth steps into an ordinary, civic space? Can greatness be measured the same way in front of a gavel as it is before a spotlight? The hush deepened as the bailiff swore him in. Elvis raised his right hand, the solemn motion oddly theatrical simply because it was him. Cameras clicked discreetly from the press gallery, capturing every second, but beneath the murmurs and curiosity, something else stirred, a tension that would soon break. What began as amused curiosity was about to turn into something far more unsettling, but what began as amused curiosity soon turned into something else entirely. Judge Harold Whitman had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades. A tall man with silvered hair and an unshakable air of authority, he was not accustomed to sharing attention. Yet that morning, it was clear that every gaze in the chamber rested not on him, but on the man in the navy suit at the witness stand. As Elvis leaned forward to adjust the microphone, the room stirred again. It was such a familiar sight, the quick touch of hand to mic, the subtle lean of his shoulders, that many in the gallery instinctively expected music. Instead, a dry chuckle broke the air from the judge himself. "Mr. Presley," Whitman said, lips curling, "are you planning to sing your testimony today?" The words echoed, bouncing off the courtroom's wooden walls. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then a ripple of laughter spread from the benches. Some giggled nervously, others laughed outright. A few reporters even clapped their hands against their knees. It was as though the court had turned into a parody of itself. The king reduced to a punchline. Elvis froze, his hand still resting on the microphone. His dark eyes flicked briefly toward the judge, then to the jurors. His posture remained upright, but a flush rose across his cheekbones. In front of 250 people, men in suits, women in Sunday dresses. Young fans pressed shoulder to shoulder. The legend had been mocked by the very authority meant to uphold. Dignity, a reflective question, lingers for us. How would you react if the highest voice in the room ridiculed you before you even had the chance to speak? Would you fire back? Would you wither? Or would you wait for the silence to return? The laughter did not fade quickly. It rattled around the chamber, filling corners where solemnity should have lived. Even a few jurors smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to indulge in the humor or maintain composure. Frank Dillard, the journalist seated near the front, later wrote, "It was an astonishing moment. I remember thinking that Elvis Presley, the man who commanded arenas, was suddenly at the mercy of one man's wit. You could feel the room tilt. Was he going to collapse under it, or rise above it?" Elvis adjusted the microphone once more, deliberately this time. He did not smile. He did not frown. His silence carried a strange weight, as though he were measuring every breath. The crowd grew uneasy. Chuckles trailed off into throats cleared, shoes shuffled, coughs swallowed. Security officers along the walls exchanged tense glances. They knew how quickly a crowd's energy could flip from humor to chaos, from ridicule to protest. Elvis's fans were known for fierce loyalty. If he reacted with anger, the room might erupt. This was the test. Would the king of rock and roll bow under courtroom laughter, or would he remind them of the dignity he carried even when stripped of stage lights? The moment stretched thin, every second heavy. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, as if to punctuate his own joke. But the tone had already shifted. The smirk on Whitman's face now seemed less certain, his eyes darting to the restless crowd. And then Elvis moved. Not with words, not with defiance, but with something no one in that chamber had anticipated. Instead of shrinking, Elvis did something no one expected. The laughter that had erupted moments earlier began to feel less like humor and more like a mistake. It hung in the air, awkward and unfinished, as though no one knew how to end it. A few smothered chuckles clung stubbornly to the corners of the courtroom, but most eyes now studied Elvis with wary anticipation. He sat perfectly still. One hand rested on the witness stand, the other curled loosely in his lap. The flush on his cheeks had faded, replaced by something calmer, a composure that unsettled even the judge. Elvis's silence was not weakness. It was weight. Reporters noticed it first. Pens slowed against notebooks. Cameras, which had been clicking relentlessly, hesitated. Frank Dillard scribbled in his margin. Crowd uneasy, waiting for him to strike back. You could almost hear the room breathing together. A single shared inhale. Some fans in the gallery bristled at the judge's remark. A young woman in a red dress whispered sharply, "That wasn't right," and her companion nodded. From the far back, an older man muttered, Show him respect. He's done more for this city than anyone. Their murmurs carried, tugging at the mood of the room. Deputy Marshal Carl Reeves, stationed by the door, shifted his stance. Years of experience told him that crowds could be unpredictable. Elvis's fans had a history of surging forward, of blurring the line between adoration and frenzy. If Presley gave the slightest sign of anger, Reeves knew the chamber could ignite, and there lay the stakes. In an arena, Elvis could command 20,000 with a wink. But here, before 250 compressed souls, he risked losing control. The laughter could harden into disrespect. The respect could tip into chaos. And the newspapers waiting for tomorrow's headlines were already sharpening their pens. A reflective question presses itself upon us. Have you ever felt the weight of an entire room waiting on your reaction, knowing that your next move could define how every single person remembers you? Elvis's eyes swept slowly across the room. He looked first at the reporters, their notebooks half filled with laughter lines. Then the jurors, some of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, his gaze lifted to Judge Whitman. There was no defiance in it, but neither was there submission. It was the stare of a man who knew he carried something heavier than fame, dignity. The silence thickened. Shoes scuffed against the floor. A cough cracked from the back row. Even the sound of a pen dropping made heads turn. The courtroom, which only moments before had roared with laughter, now trembled on the edge of something else entirely. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. He had intended to move the proceedings forward briskly, but his own attempt at humor now lay awkwardly between him and the man at the stand. For the first time that morning, he seemed uncertain. His gavel rested untouched. Meanwhile, Elvis shifted. Not dramatically, but with enough intent that the movement rippled through the benches like a current. He rose from his chair, the fabric of his suit brushing softly against the wood. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready once again. Fans clutched at their purses and handkerchiefs. Deputies tensed, every muscle primed for sudden noise. He did not speak. He did not smile. He simply stood, tall, unhurried, steady. The silence now was absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. And then, with every gaze locked on him, Elvis placed one hand inside his jacket pocket. The crowd drew breath as one, bracing for something they could not yet name. With the silence tightening, Elvis rose from his chair. Elvis stood in absolute stillness, the air around him humming with expectation. Every seat creaked as spectators leaned forward, and even the deputies along the walls held their breath. For a man known for electrifying arenas, the absence of sound was its own performance. The courtroom seemed suspended between ridicule and revelation. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, Elvis slid his hand from his pocket. In his grasp was a folded white scarf, not the glittering kind from Las Vegas shows, but a simple cotton piece, faintly creased from being carried. Fans knew the gesture well. On stage, he often tossed such scarves into the crowd as tokens of gratitude. Here, in a courtroom, it looked disarmingly out of place, without hurry. He spread the scarf across the polished wood of the witness stand. His fingers lingered for a moment, pressing the cloth flat as though consecrating it. Then, with quiet gravity, he bowed his head. The effect was immediate. The laughter that had clung stubbornly to the corners of the room evaporated. It was as if the scarf itself absorbed the sound, leaving only silence. A few gasps rose, hushed, reverent, unsure. Reporters lowered their pens mid-sentence. Cameras clicked once, then faltered. Judge Whitman's smirk vanished. He shifted in his seat, tapping the handle of his gavel but not daring to bring it down. His eyes, accustomed to dominance, now darted from Elvis to the jurors, to the suddenly subdued gallery. Frank Dillard, the journalist, later recalled, the moment was surreal. It was as if Presley had turned a courtroom into his stage, but not with music, with silence. We all realized we were part of something we couldn't quite name. Elvis remained motionless, head bowed, hands resting gently on the scarf. Seconds stretched into a minute. No one spoke. The courtroom, once restless, was now dead silent. A reflective question arises for us. Why does silence often carry more power than words? What happens when dignity itself becomes a form of resistance? When he finally lifted his head, his expression was unreadable. His eyes, dark and steady, swept the room with a calm intensity. He did not glare. He did not smile. But his gaze carried weight, the kind that pressed into every witness, every reporter, every fan. Then came the break. 5 words, spoken quietly, but carried on a current so strong they seemed to echo louder than any amplifier. I'm here for the truth. Short, steady, without anger, without ornament. The chamber exhaled as one. Some jurors nodded unconsciously. A woman in the gallery dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even the deputies, rigid against the walls, softened in their stances. What had moments earlier felt like ridicule now felt like reverence. Pattern breaker lines seemed etched in the air. The laughter stopped. The scarf remained. The silence ruled. For Judge Whitman, the moment was humbling. His authority had not been challenged, but rather redefined. Presley had turned a jest into a gesture, and in doing so reminded everyone, including the man in the robe, that respect could be commanded without force. Elvis eased back into his chair, but the atmosphere never returned to what it had been. He was no longer a celebrity under scrutiny, nor a punchline waiting to happen. He was a man who had chosen dignity over anger, silence over spectacle. The reporters knew instantly that this was their story. Pens scratched again, this time not with jokes, but with phrases like unexpected reverence, and silence fell like a curtain. And in that moment, a courtroom became more than a chamber of law. It became a stage where compassion eclipsed ridicule, and where one quiet gesture rewrote the narrative. And then Elvis broke the silence with just 5 words. The 5 words hung in the air like a chord sustained on a grand piano. I'm here for the truth. They were plain, almost austere, but in that moment they carried more resonance than any song. The crowd, which had begun the morning ready for spectacle, felt the shift instantly. No one laughed. No one whispered. They simply listened. Elvis leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, steady. He explained that his presence in court was not a performance, not a publicity stunt, but an act of loyalty. The case involved a close friend whose property rights had been challenged, and Elvis had come to testify honestly, nothing more. There was no stagecraft in his tone, only conviction. Reporters, who had been scribbling furiously during the judge's jest, now slowed their pens. Words like mockery were replaced with gravity and unexpected composure. Jurors, once stiff and uncertain, began to lean in, their expressions softening. Even Judge Whitman, who had started the morning with a smirk, found himself adjusting his glasses nervously as the weight of Presley's sincerity settled over the courtroom. A reflective question rises here. Why does sincerity disarm even the harshest critics? What is it about truth, plainly spoken, that can quiet a room more powerfully than anger ever could? Elvis spoke without flourish. He did not raise his voice or embellish his story. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, offered like a steady hand rather than a fist. The scarf on the witness stand became a symbol of humility, of respect, of choosing reverence over retaliation. The crowd began to shift with him. A few nodded softly in agreement. Some clasped their hands in their laps, as though in church. The same energy that once fed laughter now flowed in the opposite direction, into stillness, into empathy. Then something remarkable happened. When Elvis concluded his testimony, silence held for a beat too long. Protocol demanded restraint, but human emotion broke through. From the back row, a woman whispered, "Thank you." It was quiet, but it carried. Others murmured similar words, a ripple of gentle approval. Despite the judge's attempt to tap his gavel for order, the applause came. Not thunderous, not wild, but a restrained, heartfelt clapping that grew until nearly the whole room joined. It was soft enough to respect the solemn setting, yet undeniable in its warmth. Against every rule of courtroom etiquette, Elvis Presley had been applauded not for singing, but for speaking the truth. Deputy Carl Reeves later admitted, "I'd never seen anything like it." The courtroom became an audience, but not the way you'd expect. They weren't fans of the music in that moment. They were witnesses to his character. For Elvis, the transformation was complete. He had turned mockery into reverence, turning the laughter of 250 into silence, and then into compassion. That single day rippled outward in ways few imagined. By dawn the next morning, Memphis newspapers carried the story on their front pages. What had begun as a courtroom curiosity had transformed into something unforgettable. The Memphis Daily Lead with the headline, "Respect in Court, Presley Silences Laughter." Other outlets echoed the same theme, dignity. Not drama had defined the day. Reporters described not only Elvis's words, but the gesture of the scarf. It became the detail readers remembered most. One article compared it to a banner of peace. Another wrote, "In a place built on testimony, a simple piece of cloth spoke louder than the gavel." The scarf itself did not vanish into obscurity. Court clerk Martha Lee, who had watched the proceedings from her desk, carefully retrieved it after the session ended. Later, she preserved it in a glass frame with a small brass plaque etched August 4th, 1972, "Respect Wins." It sat for years in her office, a quiet reminder that reverence can bloom in the most unlikely places. Beyond Memphis, the story spread quickly. Wire services picked it up, and within days it appeared in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. For fans, it became another legend to add alongside gold records and sold-out arenas. Elvis was no longer only the man who filled stadiums. He was also the man who silenced a courtroom with grace. A reflective question emerges. How often do we remember people not for what they sing or say, but for the choices they make when dignity is on trial? Judge Harold Whitman himself was changed. In later interviews, he avoided discussing the laughter that had sparked the moment, but those who knew him said he grew quieter in court, less inclined to humor at another's expense. One deputy remarked, "The king humbled him without a single harsh word." For Elvis, the event became woven into his larger legend. Fans who had been present told the story for decades, embellishing little because no embellishment was needed. The truth itself was powerful enough. They recalled how the air shifted, how pens stopped scratching, How for a brief moment everyone in the room felt united in stillness. Years later, when biographers chronicled his life, the courthouse episode often appeared in sidebars and footnotes, but always with reverence. It symbolized the man behind the music, one who valued loyalty, one who carried respect even into a place where none was guaranteed. The legacy rippled outward like concentric rings in water. It was not about legal rulings or verdicts, but about the moral verdict delivered by silence. But the moral of the story stretched beyond one courtroom. What began with laughter ended in reverence. In that Memphis courtroom, Elvis showed that greatness is not only measured by applause in an arena, but also by how one carries themselves when dignity is tested. He chose not to retaliate with anger, nor to shrink in embarrassment. Instead, with a scarf and 5 quiet words, he transformed ridicule into respect. The lesson is timeless. When mocked, when reduced to a punchline, our instinct may be to strike back. Yet sometimes the most powerful answer is a gesture of calm, a silence that demands reflection. Elvis's choice that day was not about winning a case, but about showing character. A reflective question remains. In the moments when you are belittled, what gesture could you make that speaks louder than anger? If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes respect is stronger than ridicule. What Elvis did in that courtroom still speaks to us today, that dignity can silence even the loudest laughter. Tell us in the comments, what moment of quiet strength have you witnessed?